Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bouncing Back. I'm your host, Joanna, and on today's topic, we are going to be chatting about purposeful parenthood and how we can nurture resilient families. So I'd love to welcome our guest, Justin Coulson, onto the show today to help me do that. Justin is the co-host and parenting expert on Channel 9's Parental Guidance, and he's also the founder of Happy Families. Hi, Justin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. Nice to be able to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Before we get started, I'd love if you could tell us a bit more about what you do.
Sure thing. Maybe a little bit of history, if I can. Everyone's got a little bit of narcissism in them. Here comes mine right at the very outset. So my personal history. I was a lousy dad. I got married when I was kind of young. I think I was 22. My wife, Kylie, was 19. A couple of years later, 18 months later, we had our first child. So I'm 24. Kylie's 21. We've got our first baby in the house. And I thought I was going to be a better parent than any other parent out there. I thought that I'd observed what my parents had done. I'd observed what other people were doing with their kids. And as our little baby was growing, I was thinking, yep, my kid's going to be better than all the rest. I'm going to get this right. I'm not going to have one of those toddlers that answers back. I'm not going to have one of those toddlers that doesn't sleep through the night or won't eat their food. I'm just going to nail this. And what I discovered in pretty short order was that I was terrible at parenting. I had no idea what I was doing. And I really believed that the only way that I could get my child to do as she was told was to break her will, to make her understand that I was the father and she needed to listen. Anybody who's listening right now and has children would be face-palming themselves about now and saying, you have no idea. And the reality is I didn't. We had our second child 3 years later to the day. They're twins 3 years apart. And when our second daughter was born, I realized that I was completely outmatched from the point of view that everything that I'd been trying was not working. I now had a three-nager and I was worse than ever. And after one particularly bad day that I won't go into, it's just a horrible story where I got all my parenting wrong and I did all the stuff that you're not supposed to do. But of course, I hadn't done well at school. I didn't have much education. I certainly didn't know anything about psychology or relationships. I was a radio announcer. What I ended up doing was just losing the plot with this kid, doing all the wrong stuff. And then when she finally fell asleep on the carpet behind her door of the bedroom that I'd locked her in, my wife came home. She'd been out, which is why it all happened anyway. If I'd left it to Kylie, none of this would have happened. And I explained to Kylie that I'd completely blown it, that I was a bad father. And I was expecting my wonderful, supportive wife to say, kids are hard and you're doing the best you can and I love you anyway. And instead, she just said, you're not the father that I hoped you'd be, that's for sure. Which just kind of, it floored me. I wasn't expecting that. And I was at the point where I was admitting the truth to myself, but hearing my wife say it to me, knowing that she felt that way, I just felt like I was absolutely failing. And then she followed it up by highlighting that I wasn't quite the husband she'd hoped I'd be either, which was, it was kind of a brutal 3 minutes in my life and quite seminal in terms of what happened. So I was working at one of the biggest radio stations in Australia. It's called B105. And I'd been on air for a while there and was very, very good at my job, but obviously hopeless at home. And so I quit my job. I went back to school. And for the next 8.5 years, I studied full time. I had to do a year of TAFE or technical college first. Then I got into university, did my 4 years of undergraduate psychology, and then a subsequent 3.5 years or thereabouts of doctoral study before I finally graduated with a PhD in psychology. Along the way, we went from having 2 kids to 3 kids to 4 kids. And then I did the PhD. We had our 5th child. And a couple of years later, once I'd finished the PhD and I'd been lecturing at the university and doing some some adjunct research work. I left the university context completely, stopped being an academic, and started writing books and giving talks. Had our sixth child shortly thereafter. So nowadays, I'm a professional speaker. I travel the country and I give talks to people about how to improve their family relationships and their well-being, how to help with all the issues that people deal with in family life. I've written 9 books. I'm working on my 10th book at the moment. Had a TV show, got the #1 podcast in the country on parenting and family life. And my wife and I are the parents of 6 daughters. That little one that started it all, the little one who pretty much ruined me when she was just 3. She's now in her mid-20s. She and her husband have just had their first baby. So Kylie and I are now grandparents. And the reason I sort of shared that extended story / bio, the history narrative, is to highlight the #1, parenting sucks. And most of us are really bad at it, especially at the beginning. #2, there is stuff that you can learn that will literally transform your family. And therefore, #3, happy families do exist if we can work out what the secret formula is, because I went from being an absolutely failure as a family to having what I could only call a delightful and flourishing family. And it really is the greatest blessing in my life.
Wow, I'm floored. That was probably the best little introduction ever. Thank you so much, Justin, for that. You had me hooked the entire time. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And how do you go from like a point where you're feeling the absolute worst about your parenting and about potentially your relationship to a point where you're flourishing and you feel more confidence in your ability as a parent and contributor towards a family?
I'm going to tell another story to illustrate how this works, because just saying step 1, step 2, step 3 it's too easy to dismiss it. If we go back to about, I think it was 1911, Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian, was in the race of his life against Robert Falcon Scott, a very well-resourced British explorer. They were both trying to get to the South Pole. They wanted to be the first person to plant the flag and claim the pole for their country. So South Pole, Antarctica, it's the most elevated, driest, coldest, windiest, most inhospitable place on the planet. And to get from where the boats are moored to the pole and back is a journey of approximately 3,000 kilometers. For argument's sake, what we're going to do today is just call it 2,000 miles. And the reason I'm going to call it 2,000 miles is because of what the different strategies were to get to the pole and get back. Scott and his team pretty much made the best going that they could when the going was good, and then they'd hunker down, set up camp, and just wait it out when there was a whiteout or a blizzard. But it was hard, then stop, and then hard and stop. It was just do whatever you can whenever you can kind of an approach. And they were doing science, and they were doing a whole lot of other things as well, which kind of got in their way. Comparatively, Roald Amundsen, this Norwegian explorer, he said to his team, essentially, we're going to do this 2,000 miles across 100 days. We're going to do 20 miles a day, regardless of what else is going on, regardless of the weather, regardless of whether we can see. We're going to do 20 miles a day. It's our 20-mile march. For those who are not familiar with the story, Scott and his British team perished. They got to the pole second. Amundsen had already arrived, and they died about 11 miles shy of a food dump that they'd made on the way out. They just couldn't get there, and they passed away. Amundsen, on the other hand, he made it back on day 99. He basically did a 20-mile march, got there, 20-mile march, got back, did the whole thing across that 3-month period, and is known in the history books as the victor, the one who actually did it. So when you say, how do you go from a family that's completely falling apart to a family that's flourishing? It's a 20-mile march. It's what am I going to do every single day? What are the things that matter most for me to get from A to B and achieve the goal? For me and my family, I've got a handful of things that I know are absolutely essential that I need to do on a day-to-day basis. It's my 20-mile march. If I do A, B, and C, then I know that my family is going to do better. If my family is doing better, then we have that wonderful sense of competence and capability. We know that we're on the right track, and then it's just about refining. So my 20-mile march, #1, sleep. I'm supposed to be a parenting researcher, right? A psychology expert. But the best thing you can do to be a better parent, the best thing that you can do to raise happy, flourishing kids is to make sure that you get enough sleep. Anyone who's a parent knows that if they have a lousy night's sleep, they wake up the next day and they are going to be a crappier parent than they will be if they get a good night's sleep. Full stop, end of story. Like, sleep is the #1 parenting hack.
Yeah.
And it's good for the kids as well, I might just add. The number two thing, my wife and I, several years ago, instituted a habit that has absolutely changed our family. Um, a lot of people will say, I can't get on the same page as my partner. We're just not aligned, or I'm going this way, they're going that way. We both think that we know what the right thing is, and nothing's working out. What I realized after a few years of running my own business was that once a quarter, I would completely stop work. I'd pull my team together and we would have a 1 or 2 day strategy meeting. We'd sit down and we'd talk about what the last quarter had looked like. We'd look at what our bigger goals were, plan out the next quarter, and even do a bird's eye view of the subsequent quarter, the one following.
Yeah.
And one time after coming back from that 1 or 2 day business quarterly immersion, is what we call it, I had a chat with my wife about it. And I said, my business is important. This stuff really matters. But it's not nearly as important as our family. And it's just occurred to me that we don't do anything for our family.
Yeah.
Nothing like this at all. And so what we started to do was to implement the same sort of processes that we have in my business in our family. And it changed things enormously. Once a quarter, my wife and I go away for a couple of nights. We have a lot of fun together because we like being with one another. That's why you get married, right? But we have an agenda. We talk about the kids. We talk about the extracurricular activities. We talk about the friendships that we need to reinvigorate and restore. We talk about the holidays that we need to plan or how the kids are going at school. Like, we just talk about everything that needs to be discussed. And then we make plans. We work out, how do we implement this? What needs to go into the diary? Who's going to take care of what, when, how, and where? Subsequent to that, every Sunday, Kylie and I have a couples meeting. We sit down together and we ask ourselves 3 questions. Number 1, what's going well? Like, what's working this week? Number 2, what's not working at the moment? And number 3, what do we need to tweak or adjust? If there was just 1 or 2 things that we were going to shift, what would they be? And it's wonderful for creating alignment and staying focused on your purpose. Now, I know some people are listening to this and going, oh my goodness, that's so extra. But this is how you do it, right? If things aren't good, you've got to do something different. And this is the thing. We do the same thing with our kids. We sit down on a Sunday for about 15 minutes, pull out some treats, some snacks, and we say, hey kids, what's going well, what's not? What are we going to do this week to make it better? So again, it's about getting that alignment, getting everyone on the same page, getting focused on purpose. So number 1, sleep. Number 2, the family meetings. And the third thing that we make sure that we do is we have consistent rituals of connection. And what I mean by rituals of connection is simply, what are the things that we do consistently that help the kids to know and help us as a couple to know that we are connecting, that we matter in each other's lives? My definition of connection is feeling seen, heard, and valued. So what are we doing in the mornings? What are we doing in the evenings? What are we doing on the weekends? So that everyone in the family feels seen, heard, and valued, so that they know that they belong to something that's much greater than the individual component parts. That's our 20-mile march.
Yeah. Wow. And when you were talking, I'm really noticing how it's a lot about a partnership and working together and uniting your whole family together, which is super important. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'd love to dive into that a bit later. But first, we have a section called Have You Met Justin? So here we're just going to get to know you a bit more with some little get to know you questions and dive right back into all that. So my first question for you here is, what is your favorite book?
Favorite book? It changes consistently, regularly. It depends on what I'm reading. I think that if I was to pick a well-being book, I'd have to say that it would probably be a book called The Happiness Hypothesis. By a guy who is widely considered one of the world's leading psychology thinkers, maybe one of the world's leading academics. His name is Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. I just think that book is fabulous. I've got this list, though, of like 20 books that I absolutely love. And on any given day, one of them might be on top of the list. As well as that, I've got a faith background, so I have a particular soft spot for sacred texts. I just think that ancient wisdom is too easily dismissed in a world that is all about science and what can you show me, what can you prove with data. And regardless of what your faith background is, there's just tremendous ancient wisdom that we can lean on heavily and learn so much from.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's so profound as well, but it's so overlooked because it's so dated or outdated. Yeah. And that book, The Happiness Hypothesis, you said, what's probably your key takeaway from that?
Oh, I'd say that the main idea that Haidt really wants to get across to us is that it's hard to change. Our mind, our subconscious mind is what he calls the elephant, and our conscious mind is the rider.
Yeah.
And the rider really does think that it's in charge, but it's the subconscious that's driving everything. And so if we want to be happier, we need to retrain our subconscious mind. When I bring that into my own life, the way that I describe it is my brain often tells me lies. My brain makes me think certain things that aren't really true, because my brain is about making me feel good. That's what the brain's one of the brain's central tasks is. How do I help the organism that I'm controlling to feel comfortable, to feel nice, to feel satisfied? And so my brain does at 9 o'clock at night. My brain says one more episode won't hurt. Or as I'm driving past KFC and I haven't eaten for a few hours, my brain says those 11 secret herbs and spices are just what you need right now. But my body has a different way of perceiving the world. And if I listen to my brain too much, I make decisions that aren't in my best interests. I stay up until midnight because that one episode turns into 4 episodes, or I eat the KFC, and 5 minutes after I've had that first mouthful, which tasted so good, I'm regretting the fact that I stopped and paid money for that disgustingly greasy ooze that's now going through my body. And so I guess the big take home from the happiness hypothesis is, if we can learn the habits that will retrain our subconscious and move towards ultimately what Aristotle called eudaimonia, or virtuous living, we're going to have to make hard decisions in the here and now that go against what our brain wants, because our character, our identity, our physical well-being will all benefit from making the hard choice now to have the better outcome later.
I love that. And it's so hard in the moment, right? Like, driving past KFC, you're like, this won't hurt. I'll start again tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes around and you do the same thing over and over again. And it just reinforces how hard change is, and how rewiring your mind and your subconscious is actually such a difficult task.
So much, Joe. Yeah, 100% agree with you.
Great. Well,
can I ask you, what's your favorite book? Like, what's on the top of your list at the moment?
Oh, it's always changing. I've got so many favorites. The Alchemist is one of my favorite books. I really love it.
I've heard of it. I've heard of it. I think my daughter has it on her bookshelf, but I haven't picked it up. So there's a strong recommendation for me. I'll check it out.
Oh, definitely. It's such a good book. It's a pretty small read, but it's so profound, and I love it. Yeah, really changed me for sure.
Beautiful. Thank you.
That's okay. Beautiful. So I'd love to move on to our next question, which is, what is a movie you've watched recently that you've enjoyed?
This is, I don't do movies. I know that I'm probably missing out on stuff, but I reckon I just watch a handful of movies a year, usually under duress, because somebody's forcing me to go and watch the movie with the family. If I'm going to have quality time with somebody, I don't want to be staring at a screen.
Fair enough.
And because I stare at a screen so much for work, I don't want to then in my downtime continue to stay confined in the 4 walls of my office or my bedroom or my living room and stare at another screen. So I'm very much a person who says, let's get outside, let's ride bikes, let's go surfing, let's just touch the grass, look at the sky, and put the screens away. I'm not a huge movie person. If I had to tell you my favorite movie of all time, I would go with The Princess Bride.
Oh, a classic.
Absolute classic. Yeah. It's beautiful. It's entertaining. It's got great messages. It's so much fun. Princess Bride for me, all the way.
Yeah, I love that. Such a good one. Thank you for that. And I've got a couple more here. So my next one is, are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
I listen to so many podcasts. I can't stay on top of them all. And they're really eclectic. They're quite broad in terms of what I listen to. So I'll grab my phone right here and I'll go through a handful of them for you right now. And I'm not going to do the socially desirable thing and just tell you the ones that I think are cool. I'm literally going to just tell you what's there. So I listen to my podcast, the Happy Families podcast. I get my news from, my news podcast is The Front. I listen to The Daily from the New York Times. I listen to Honestly with Barry Weiss. Probably my favorite podcast at the moment is the Prof G podcast with Scott Galloway. The guy is really crass. I absolutely detest his crassness. I mean, it's deplorable. It's absolutely deplorable. Nevertheless, the quality of the rest of his content, other than his crass jokes at the start of his podcast and occasional vulgarity throughout, the quality of the insight that he brings is just second to none. I love listening to Hamish and Andy. I listen to Work Life with Adam Grant. and I'm listening to another one that's called Game Changers Radio, because I just can't leave the radio industry alone, even though I left it 20 years ago. So they're just a handful. There's more there, but they're kind of the main ones that I love listening to.
Wow, that's cool. Quite a comprehensive list there. So would you say that
Too much information, sorry.
No, that's very comprehensive. I love it. I've heard probably a couple of them. I'm more into like the true crime kind of end of things. But I used to listen to the Squiz podcast, if you've heard of that one.
No, I haven't heard of the Squiz, but true crime, I've tried true crime. It just depresses me. It makes me scared to go outside. I'd like to believe that the world is actually safe and that the people who are on those podcasts are in the incredibly small, minute minority. But listening to it makes me feel like everybody is out to get me, so I just can't do it.
Oh, that's so fair. I love it. I'm like on the edge of my seat listening to what's going to happen next, and I'll go down a rabbit hole on Google researching the case. Right. But not for everyone, so I understand that. But
can't sleep if I'm watching that sort of stuff or listening to that sort of stuff.
That's so fair. But the Squiz is a great one. It's a news podcast, and every day they give you the news from the previous day or the day in 10 minutes.
Gotcha.
It's a really great way to get your news if you're short for time. So I love that one.
Nice recommendation.
Great. Well, I've got one more here for you, which is, do you have a role model? And when I ask this question, it doesn't have to be a famous role model. It could just be anyone in your life.
Yeah. I have a handful of people that I look up to for different reasons in different ways. There's a guy called Alfie Kohn. He wrote a book that I was going to call my favorite, but it's just a little bit... Every now and again, it grates me the wrong way. Nevertheless, he's written a book called Unconditional Parenting, the one that got me interested in psychology and helped me to realize that my parenting was off track and I needed help. Yeah. It's called Punished by Rewards. I now have about 8 or 9 of his books on my shelf. He's written The Myth of the Spoiled Child, The Homework Myth, and a whole lot of other really, really smart books. So I look to him in terms of the way that he takes complicated science and creates an incredible story around it. An academic researcher by the name of Richard Ryan, he's the guy, along with his collaborator, Ed Deasy, who at the University of Rochester in the late 1970s started to question the fundamentals of behaviorist psychology and developed what's known as self-determination theory. Richard Ryan is the most cited professor of psychology living on the planet right now, and self-determination theory has become one of the, if not the most researched psychological theories. It's profound, it's powerful, and everything that we talk about throughout this podcast will probably be an extension of or built upon that theory. It's just brilliant. And Richard Ryan himself, I've become acquainted with him and have become friends with him, and he's just a delightful human in terms of his insight and his desire to help people to understand human nature better. His motives are just so pure. He's not interested in commercializing his research. He just wants to help humanity, and he's extraordinary. And the other one that I would mention would be a guy called Wally Goddard. He used to be a professor of family life development at the University of Arkansas. He was writing some articles for a religiously oriented online magazine that I discovered, and his articles happened to pop up in my life at about the same time as the Alfie Kohn books popped up. Wally Goddard basically writes these articles where he draws on Christian principles, Christian teachings, and interweaves them with great parenting science to help us to become better parents. And I got to know Wally over the years, and now my wife and I go and visit with him and his wife and family every couple of years in the United States, and we've become wonderful friends. And when I'm really stuck, I genuinely sit there, close my eyes, and think, what would Wally do? And then I try to just be Wally, because he's such a wonderful mentor and such a wonderful, wonderful role model.
Yeah, I actually love that. When you think about, if you're stuck, just think about your role models, sit there and be like, what would they do? That's perfect.
And then go and do it. Yeah, there's a psychological principle called psychological distancing or self-distancing. And researchers have shown that when you're really in the heat of things, when you're feeling absolutely under so much pressure, you can't think particularly clearly. But you can create psychological distance by imagining that you're somebody else doing the thing. And it sort of takes you out of it, and somebody else gets to step in and do it instead, even though it's you. And it gives you that psychological distance. You tend to act far more wisely when you do that.
Super interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And now I'd love to dive right back into everything we were talking about. But I'd like to start off simple and with defining what resilience means in the context of parenting.
Okay. So I know you said simple, But as you've probably noticed, I've always got something to say that's never simple.
Yeah.
Most people, when they think about resilience, they think, well, it's just bouncing back. Something hard happens, something horrible happens, something difficult happens, something volatile or random happens, and I bounce back and get on with life again. I find that really dismissive, quite glib, and not at all consistent with what happens in real life. When I think about the hardships, trials, adversities, and difficulties that I've faced in my life, it's very rare that I bounce back from it and just go and pick up from where I was. I'm changed by those things. To get really deep and really serious very, very quickly. In early November 6th last year, my nephew, he was 20 years old and he took his life. This is just a profoundly distressing, overwhelming thing that impacted our family, and it completely shattered all of us. It just hurt so much. And to say that I'm going to just bounce back from that is, like I said, it's awfully dismissive. It's so far removed from the reality of what we've been through. You don't bounce back from that. If someone loses a loved one to cancer, if somebody goes through a divorce or separation, if somebody, one of my friends had his 4-year-old diagnosed with brain cancer, I mean, you don't just bounce back. This stuff is deeply troubling and enormously trying. And so the idea of bouncing back, I just find to be inconsistent with what real life is like. Sure, you didn't make the team. Sure, you failed an exam. You can bounce back. I think that's probably a little bit different. But true resilience requires more than just bouncing back. So when we think about resilience in engineering terms, you look at a bridge or a house or some kind of structure that's been built. And the idea with a resilient structure is that it stands firm under pressure. Okay, so if it's a bridge, the tide goes underneath it and the bridge stays firm. The lightning and the thunderstorms and the weight of the trucks and the traffic and the trains or whatever else, the bridge stays where it is. It's resilient.
Yeah.
And people usually would therefore say, well, the opposite of that is when it breaks under pressure. That's not entirely true. Well, I guess it's partly true. If something breaks under pressure, we call it fragile. So an egg is a perfect example of that. A lot of people treat their kids like they're eggs, by the way. They treat them very, very fragile. But breaking down under pressure, the opposite of that is not staying firm under pressure. The opposite of that is improving, strengthening under pressure. We don't have a word for that in the English language. In terms of what we mean from a psychological standpoint, when we're talking about resilience, we're actually talking about that thing that we don't have a word for. And so we use the word resilience, but it's not technically the correct word. So an author by the name of Nassim Taleb, who wrote books like The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness, he also wrote another book called Anti-Fragile. And the concept of anti-fragility takes the place of the word resilience because we don't have a word for the opposite of breaking down under pressure, that is getting stronger under pressure. But you and I as complex organisms and our children as complex organisms, if we are shielded from pressure, if we're shielded and cocooned and bubble wrapped and spoon fed and mollycoddled, we don't experience the pressure that we need to grow stronger.
Yeah.
And therefore we atrophy. We atrophy in terms of character. We atrophy in terms of physical strength, cognitive strength, social strength, pretty much all the resources that we need to navigate life effectively. They all break down if we don't carry a load. So for our purposes in today's conversation, we're going to use the term resilience, but what I really mean is experiencing pressure and growing through it. That is, experiencing adaptive outcomes to challenge and avoiding maladaptive outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. And first of all, I'd like to say I'm sorry for your loss, Justin. But also, I think that's such an important topic that you bring up, because when people are going through a hard time, often the advice they get is, you'll be fine, you'll get over it, you'll get through it. But when you're going through it, that kind of advice or hearing that stuff is like, yeah, I know I will, but also it's quite dismissive.
But also, I want to punch you for saying it.
yeah. Like, oh, thank you. I didn't know that. That's
right.
so refreshing. It's exactly what I needed to hear. But it's so important to bring that up. So thank you for doing that. And when we talk about how parents can cultivate resilience, how can they do that during challenging times in parenthood?
Okay, so the number one thing, with no exceptions, the number one thing that's associated with building resilience in kids is having a strong sense of connection with ideally a primary carer, ideally a mum or a dad or an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, whoever's looking after the child, or even a foster carer, depending on your context and your circumstances. But the more we can have that primary carer or primary carers being biologically related and ideally literally the biological parents of that child, the more likely it is that they are going to flourish. They need stability, they need consistency, they need predictability. And when they have that sense of connection, of mattering, of belonging, I don't know if you recall my definition of connection that I shared earlier, feeling seen, heard, and valued. When kids feel seen, heard, and valued consistently and predictably over time, it builds a sense of security. They believe that the world is safe. They believe that they are of value, and they're much more likely to behave in resilient ways. There is simply no substitute whatsoever for high quality, connected, mattering relationships. That's it. Whether things are good or bad, whether the weather's inclement or sunny, we need those relationships. To highlight exactly how important this is, maybe I can quickly share, I think, one of the most important studies in all of humanity's history. In the 1950s, a sociologist called Emmy Werner stepped into the Hawaiian island of Kauai, where there was a community that was known to have some intergenerational challenges. It was the 1950s, so being a single mum it carried a lot more stigma than it does today. And even today, it still has some stigma, minimal compared to then, but still contains some. Nevertheless, in the 1950s, high levels of unwed mums, single mums, teenage pregnancies, alcohol and drug use and abuse, high levels of poverty, kids weren't finishing school, lots of kids, especially the boys, were going to jail, violent crime. I mean, it was just a really tough community. It was not the kind of place where you would say, let's build a summer home here. And Werner went into that community with a 10-year research grant so that she could study dysfunction. What she did, I can't remember the exact year. I think from memory it was 1956. I might be a year or two off there, but let's just go with 1956. Every single child born in the community that year, she followed for the next 10 years. She, as they got older, had them complete questionnaires. She did interviews with them every so often. She also interviewed the parents. When the parents weren't available, she interviewed the caregivers. She spoke to school teachers, scout leaders, church leaders, community people, neighbors, whoever she could, to work out what was going on in these children's lives and collect as much data as she could about how they were progressing. There were, again, I'm a bit shaky on the number. I think it was something like 660, 670 kids that year that were born in this community. She ended up getting a grant for another 10 years to study this ongoing dysfunction. And then another 10. And finally, in the 1990s, after 40 years of researching these families, the study wrapped up. The breadth and depth of data that she collected was astonishing. And as she was going through and looking at the contributors to dysfunction, what Werner discovered was that there was 2/3 of those kids, 2/3 followed the patterns of their parents. They didn't finish high school. They got involved with alcohol and drugs. There was violence. There was jail. There was single parenthood and like teenage pregnancy, all that sort of thing. But 1/3 didn't. Around about 220, 230 of these kids grew up to finish high school, to function beautifully well, to have flourishing relationships. Many of them went to university. They held down steady jobs. They stayed out of jail and stayed off drugs. Like they were the picture of resilience and positive contribution to the world. They were killing it. And when she went back through the research and had a look, the number one predictor of what led to these positive outcomes was that each of those kids had a significant adult in their life who was there for them, who was not just there for them, but who was realistically irrationally crazy about this kid. They loved them no matter what. In fact, they would say things like, it doesn't matter how many times you stuff up, I'll always be here for you. My love for you is bigger than the car crash that you just had in my new car. My love for you is bigger for you than the exams that you've just failed, or the fact that you ended up in court because you've gone and done the wrong thing. That person was unconditionally there for them. Doesn't mean that they didn't have expectations. They weren't permissive and laissez-faire and saying, do what you want. In fact, quite the contrary, because they loved them, they were trying to guide them with effective limits. But they had an adult who was simply there. The number one predictor of the resilient, positive outcomes in these kids. And it often wasn't a parent. Often it was a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle who was a caregiver. Sometimes it was a church leader or a school teacher or a neighbor, but they had someone. And there's no message that's more important than that when it comes to our kids' resilience.
Yeah, definitely. Having that one person that you can rely on that will always be there for you. And the more you've been talking, the more I'm realizing that there are a lot of parents out there who probably don't have this sort of knowledge or education that they need to do the right things or be there for their kids. So how do they go about obtaining that so they can give their kids sort of the guidance that they need?
So I don't really think you need a parenting expert to know how to be there for your kids. This is something that we all intrinsically, when you have a child, your body starts to change, both for mums and dads. And there's all of these new hormones that buzz around, especially the oxytocin stuff, right? This is the bonding hormone, the one that makes you love the person that you're with even more. And so we've already got that. What we've really got to do is get the stuff that's in our lives that acts as an impediment to bonding out of our lives. If we can reduce the impediments, then we're going to find it really, really easy to be the person that's there for them. I think it's not a question of additions as much as it's a question of subtraction. So I'm talking about subtracting screens from your lives. Ongoing involvement in screens, looking at screens, having a screen constantly connected to your fingertips will get in the way of your capacity to connect, because when you're staring at a screen, the people around you do not feel seen, heard, or valued.
Yeah.
Another thing that I would say that is a huge impediment, a tremendous impediment, is alcohol and other substances.
Yeah.
This is a scourge on our society. It's a scourge on our community. A lot of people are able to handle alcohol or even other substances in really healthy ways. They're able to deal with it in ways that are safe and that don't interfere with their connections and their productivity and their capacity to contribute. But far too many people cannot. And even those who do handle their alcohol well, most would probably agree that they're able to be more present for their loved ones when they don't have it in their system rather than when they do. I mentioned Scott Galloway before. He has this thing that I've heard him say once or twice where he says, you want to make sure that if you're consuming alcohol, that it's giving more to you than it's taking from you. And I think that's a really wise way to look at it. If it starts taking from you the opportunity to connect with others, the opportunity to be present, the opportunity to guide your children and be involved in their lives in adaptive and helpful and healthy ways, then it's got to go, or at least it's got to be reduced to a point where it stops taking so much from you.
Yeah.
And of course, we could make a really big list about all the other things. I mean, we've got our own baggage, we've got work commitments, and the fact that inflation and cost of living pressures and what it costs to buy a house, all this sort of stuff adds to rather than takes away from the pressures we feel, and therefore our ability to connect with our kids. We can't live in some utopia where we don't have to go to work. But the more that we can reduce those things that get in the way, even structured activities and chocking the calendar so full, if we pull back on that, then we've got more time for connection, more time for our kids to feel seen, heard, and valued. Simple case in point, really simple case in point. The other day, I was exhausted. I'd been in front of the computer for who knows how long, writing my next book. And my daughter showed up with my granddaughter. My daughter showed up with her little baby. So I closed up the computer and went and sat on the grass in my backyard. And my 6-month-old granddaughter sort of snuggled into me, and we just laid on the grass and stared at the sky and tickled and played for 20 or 30 minutes. And oh my goodness, it was so much more refreshing than sitting down and watching 20 minutes of TikTok or Instagram reels. I mean, it was just so good to have that connection. It was the highlight of my day.
Oh, that is so beautiful. And I want to flip the script a bit, and we're talking about being seen. And what if it's a kid, the child, noticing that their parent is a workaholic, that they don't have enough time for them, or their parents engaging in alcohol or whatever it is? How do they go about getting the advice or the help or the support they need to get through this, or reach out to their parents?
Yeah, well, the short answer is they're kind of powerless, depending on their age. As they get older, they can try to say things, but parents don't tend to take counsel from their children particularly when it's unsolicited. So kids really are powerless, although there is, again, a wonderful story. I don't know if it's true or not. It's probably apocryphal, but it could well be true, from like the 1970s, 1980s, I think it is, where a young boy says, "Dad, can I share something with you?" And Dad says, "Shortly, son, I'm busy." And then the next day, "Dad, I really want to, I'm busy, son, I'll be with you. We'll do it soon. I just can't do it now." This goes on for several days until finally the little boy walks over to Dad and says, Dad, how much money do you make every hour? And Dad says, whatever it is, let's call it in today's terms. Let's say it's like $40 or $60 an hour or something. And the little boy says, okay, and walks away. And the next afternoon, Dad walks past his little guy, and he's counting money in his money box. And he looks, and then the next day he hears the little boy asking if he can earn some money from Mum for some chores. And he stops and he says, hey, what are you doing? What I've seen you're more money focused lately than I've ever seen you. And the little boy says, I'm going to get weepy just telling you, I'm saving up so I can buy an hour of your time. And I can't believe you've done this to me, Joe. You got me all weepy. It's such a cheesy, trite story, but it still brings tears to my eyes because we've got so much research from all over the world. In fact, some recent research in Australia that was conducted by a charity called Act for Kids shows even teenagers are asked, how much time do you want to spend with your parents every day? And those teenagers on average said between 1 and 2 hours a day. And now you talk to parents of teenagers and ask them if they perceive that their kids want 1 or 2 hours a day with them, those parents are going to laugh and say, yeah, as if. But the teenagers, as much as they make it so hard for us, they actually want us in their lives. They don't necessarily want us intrusive. They don't want us telling them what to do. They don't want the correction and direction, but they do want the connection. They want the closeness. They want to know that we care. They want the boundaries and limits. And that's what helps them to feel safe, feel like the world's predictable, and ultimately flourish and be resilient.
100%. Like as a young person, the world just keeps getting bigger and bigger the more you get into the world, and you realize more and more that you want those people there around you, like your parents, your siblings, whatever it is. You want to feel closer to them so the world feels just that little bit smaller and a bit more manageable, and it's so important to have that. So, and it's a beautiful story, so thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, it's not me crying, it's you crying, I promise.
Yeah, it's me, guys. It's just all me. Don't worry. Perfect. Well, I'd love to talk about the role that mindset plays in all of this. So how do we cultivate the mindset we need to go into this with the right intentions and the right actions?
So, Joe, this just comes down to being clear on what you want. It's really just about understanding your goals and then doing that 20-mile march. So if what I really want is a flourishing family, what are the things that I need to do to get it? Once we get intentional, we become the sort of mindset comes down to identity. Identity drives purpose. And what I mean by that is once I'm clear on what I want, that shapes who I become. If I want to be a great parent, then my identity starts to shift into the direction of behaviors that help me to connect with my children and guide my children in positive, healthy, adaptive ways. So what we're really trying to do is recraft an identity. Our identities change over time. They're really sort of formed in their fundamental way during our adolescent years. But as we get older and start to develop our careers and build our families and we mature, we start to prioritize different things. Those shifts in priority change our identity because our roles shift. And as we elevate certain roles and drop off on other roles, we behave accordingly. So if I want to have a happy family, then being a great dad and a great husband becomes part of my identity. For you, it would be becoming a great mom and a great wife. And then you start to ask yourself, well, what are the things that I need to do so that I can do that? Well, I'm going to tuck the kids into bed. I'm going to read them stories. I'm going to be engaged in their lives. It's those kinds of things.
Yeah. And when we talk about mindset, I'm thinking about like self-care. And before you mentioned how important sleep is not only for the parent, but also for the children. So how can we prioritize self-care more as a parent?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because depending on how you define self-care, it can go sideways really fast. When I talk to parents about this specific topic, most people think self-care means taking a bath or going to the spa or having a massage. And Instagram has kind of created this self-care movement where it's all about indulgence. And the problem with that is I used to go to those salt cave things where you lay in the salty water and it's super buoyant and you're supposed to relax. And the whole time I was there, I was thinking pretty much, I've got this, and this to do as soon as I get out of here. And I'm spending all this money so I can lay here and I'm not resting. I'm just thinking about all the other things that I need to do. It was supposed to be self-care, and all it did was made me stressed.
Yeah.
And so the more that I've thought about self-care, the more I've realized that that's the wrong picture. To me, self-care, the idea of self-care comes from nursing research, where people who were going into hospitals to have different medications administered to them, some health departments said, well, what if we help people to care for themselves at home with this? We don't really need qualified nurses and medical practitioners to be doing this. Let's help them to self-care. And the definition has just expanded enormously. When I think of self-care, my definition of self-care today is paying off my debts, getting enough sleep, moving my body in healthy ways so that I can have energy and so that I can still, I don't know, do 5 or 10 push-ups when I'm 60 or 70. Self-care is sitting on the grass and breathing, connecting with people that matter, going out to breakfast with a friend once a fortnight because my relationships outside of my family matter, going for a surf because it's good for exercise. So self-care has shifted over time. Self-care is going on a date with my wife because my relationship has to have the investment in it that it needs. So for me, that's what self-care is now. And the mindset associated with that, again, it comes simply down to intentionality. What are my core values? What are the things that matter most? And how do I structure my life around that? I mentioned the Sunday meeting, Joe, the Sunday meeting that Kylie and I have. And during that meeting, we have a quick look at our calendar. And we say, all right, what are our central priorities? Which friend am I catching up with on which day so that I can invest in relationships? Which night are we having our date night? What day are we absolutely committed to being home as a family for the evening so that we can spend time together with our kids? And so those kinds of things, those intentional decisions around the identity and the purpose that I was talking about, they're the things that I think matter most. And ultimately, the mindset, it's about being intentional. It's about knowing what you're working towards. Too many people just fluff it in family life. It's like, oh, I'll make it up. I'll do whatever I do. There's no structure. There's no, we're just doing what we got to do. And I don't think that that's what leads to success in life. Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, he said the signature of mediocrity is chronic inconsistency. What he's really saying is we need to have a 20-mile march. We need to be clear about what our goal is, where are we walking, how are we hiking there, and what are our priorities while we do it.
Yeah. And when you were talking about this idea of like self-care, I was thinking that it's about deconstructing this idea of what is objectively considered self-care, you know, like spas, baths, all that stuff that you think is self-care, but what is going to make your life easier, what's going to make you feel good. Because to me, like, yeah, a bath sounds really nice, but is that going to make my life easier or make me feel better about myself? Probably not. I feel
make no mistake, sometimes it will. Like
sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes having that 20-minute bath or that 15-minute lay on the, maybe you're fortunate to have a pool in the backyard or something, having that 15-minute dip on the middle of a hot day, sometimes that's exactly what you need for self-care. But other times, it just adds pressure. So I just wanted to clarify, I'm not poo-pooing those things. Sometimes you do need the massage, and if you can be in the right mindset while you're having it, it's going to be wonderful.
100%. But for example, I always have lots of thoughts racing in my head. And I feel like if I put myself in a situation where I can feed those thoughts and continuously think about them, that's not what's going to help me. For example, going for a run or doing something active where I can be moving my body, that is what's going to help me move away from what is stressing me. So like you said, listening to yourself and what you need and what's good for you in that moment is important.
Yep, absolutely. Love it.
Great. Well, before we were talking about role models, and often kids grow up and sometimes their parents are their role models. So how can parents model resilience for their children and instill these qualities in them while they're growing up?
So if resilience is having an adaptive growth response to challenge and avoiding maladaptive responses, I guess there are two things that I would say here. Number one, that is our natural state. So humans are born and are naturally, intrinsically resilient. It's what we do. It's what humanity has done since the dawn of time. That's what makes us human. That's why we rule the world, right? That's why humans are the most productive, the most capable, the most whatever you want, mammal or animal on the planet, because we are resilient. We figure out ways to learn, grow, develop, master the environment, push through hardship and adversity, figure stuff out. We've got this fantastic prefrontal cortex that allows us to do that. So our natural state is resilience, so long as the environment is supportive of it. I need to emphasize that, so long as the environment is supportive of it.
Yeah.
In terms of maybe getting into the nitty gritty of answering your question, in some ways your question contains the answer. We need to model it so our children can be resilient. So let me give you a couple of really simple examples. And I know you're not a mum, but if you were, you're running late, you're in traffic, somebody cuts you off. How do you respond to that?
Oh, yeah.
So if you go ahead.
No, I feel like because I'm not a mum, it's so hard to know what would be right in that moment, because if I didn't have any kids in the car, or if I wasn't a mum, I would probably lash out. I would probably be like losing myself in that moment, but that's not the right thing to do.
Yeah, and the reason it's not the right thing to do is because your kids are watching, but even if the kids aren't watching, it's not a resilient response.
Yeah.
It's not a growth response. It's not a mastery response. It's not an improved response.
Yeah.
And being able to sit there, take perspective and recognize that the extra 4 seconds that you're now going to have to spend in the car because of that person cutting you off is really not that big of a deal. And if you've cut it so fine that you've only got 4 seconds to get out of the car and get into the airport or catch the train or whatever, then this is on you. You should have left 4 seconds earlier. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like taking personal responsibility, that's a resilient thing to do. And whether you've got kids in the car watching you or not, how we react to these tiny little infractions. Something comes out in a restaurant that's not quite right. How do you respond? Are you able to respond if something does need to be done? I mean, sometimes you can just suck it up and it's not that big of a deal. But if the response is required, are you able to respond in a manner that preserves the dignity of the staff that are waiting on you? Are you able to respond in a manner that is kind and compassionate, but still maintains the expectation, the boundary that you hold, the value that you hold? I'm paying good money for this. I expect a higher quality. I'm not getting what I paid for. But can you do that in a way that is supportive of the people who are serving you? Like doing all of these things, the way that we deal with an infraction in our home, when somebody says no or when somebody doesn't do as they're asked, all of these kinds of things are the world throwing just messy stuff at us. The question is, how do I respond?
Yeah.
What is my character? Because if I can respond in an adaptive and healthy way, then I'm going to teach my children that. I don't need to do explicit teaching. They're going to see it and they're going to learn that we can be dignified. We can respond in a virtuous way that builds character rather than diminishes it. They're the kinds of things that we need to be doing.
Yeah, and I had this interesting conversation with someone recently about parenting, and they said that when you think about parents, it's their first time parenting. It's their first time being a parent. It's their first time doing all of this. They haven't had some sort of practice before you came along and now they're doing the real thing. It's their first time going through all of this. So how can we practice compassion and kindness towards ourselves as parents, but also children, knowing that their parents are learning as they go as well?
We take it so seriously, and understandably so. I mean, we're not having as many kids as we once did, and we really want to get it right. I think there's probably a couple of things that I'd say to this, Joe. The first is, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to get it right.
Yeah.
which is kind of depressing, but at the same time, it does take the pressure off a little bit. So many parents say to me, "I just want my kids to fulfill their potential. I want them to have the best life they can. I want them to fulfill their potential." And I always respond to that by saying, how old were you when you fulfilled your potential?
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Right. Yeah.
What a question.
Yeah, because everyone kind of goes,
Yeah.
It's an unfair expectation. It's unfair on the kids. Like no one's running around with a Twitter profile that says I was the Ducks of year 3.
Yeah.
Right. But it's also unfair on us. How much pressure are we putting on ourselves that we are the ones that are responsible for our children fulfilling their potential? It's unfair. So getting clear on, again, what we're working towards. To me, this is the critical thing, Joe. I'm not interested in my kids fulfilling their potential. They never will, in the same way that I never will and you never will. What I'm interested in them doing is becoming people who love to learn and gain mastery, to develop, and improve.
Yeah.
I want them to be interested in being better people and developing character. Now, if they do that, I don't need to worry about their potential because they're going to be in a consistent state of growth and improvement.
Yeah.
They're going to be looking for ways that they can get better. And that is how you achieve your potential, right? And you do it by not worrying about achieving your potential, but just worrying about being the best person you can be, making the best contribution you can make.
Yeah. 100%. And I feel like that's such a great point because we put so much pressure on ourselves to be this pinnacle version of ourselves that has everything figured out, that has our life purpose sorted out. We are the best human we can possibly be, when we should sort of strip it back to what am I doing every day that contributes towards me being that person that I want to be. I don't have to be that person. I can just do those actions, and maybe one day it'll happen, maybe one day it won't, but I can be content knowing that I'm doing everything I possibly can be doing in this moment.
So you've just sparked something for me, Joe. I don't know if I'm right on this or not, but I'm just gonna throw it out there.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a certain kind of pride, maybe even a certain. We've all got a little bit of narcissism in us, every single one of us, whether we want to or not. It's there. It's just not pathological for most of us. We all think that we're pretty good, but this is a particular kind of pride that I'm going to do this. My child's going to be that, and it's really unhealthy. It puts the kids under pressure. It puts us under pressure, but ultimately, it's not an attractive thing. My own parenting journey, like I've written all the books, I've got the PhD, I'm sitting here now and I'm acting like I know it all.
Yeah.
But I don't. I've got no idea about so many things, even when it comes to parenting and relationships. The other day I was having a chat with my wife and I was just saying, what are we going to do about this particular child and this particular issue? Because I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And it's driving me up the wall. And I think having that humility is, well, it's really good. It's good for our character. It keeps us humble, and that is good. But it helps us to recognize that everybody's making it up. I'm making it up. Every parent I know, they're just making it up. I mean, every politician is making it up. Every CEO is making it up. None of us really know what we're doing. With time and with practice, we get better at identifying patterns and making more educated choices and hopefully making better choices. But ultimately, we're all still making it up as we go along. I've had 6 kids, so I've had a lot of time to make it up, and I'm seeing a lot more patterns that I can respond to really well. But I still get a whole lot of questions from my own kids, from my wife, from parents that I'm trying to help, and I'm like, geez, I don't know. I mean, here's an educated guess. Here are some things that might work, but parenting's tricky. Like to finish answering your question, I think we just got to give ourselves a break, take the pressure off, and say, I'm here to support my kids. I'm here to love my kids, and if I get that right, if the kids know that they're loved, and if they've got some pretty decent boundaries in place, ideally that we've developed together as they get older, they're going to be okay. And they'll probably go on to live really productive lives where they make a wonderful contribution because they felt that love. That's got to be the number one thing.
Yeah, and it brings it back to just putting that really compassionate lens on parenting and yourself as well, which I love. And I'd love to transition into our practices and habits section here. And we've talked a lot about practices and habits so far, but if there was one strategy or tool or piece of advice you could give a parent for cultivating resilience, what would that be?
Yeah, I'd go back to what we said before about rituals of connection.
Yeah. Rituals
of connection, making sure that the kids feel close. So that would be, I had somebody say to me recently, I want my child to read, and they'd read somewhere that reading is linked to academic outcomes and academic achievement. And I said, you know what it is? Reading is it's one of the best predictors of academic outcomes in kids, and it's wonderful if you can get your kids to read. But then I paused and I said, what I'd rather you do though, rather than getting your kids to read, is I'd rather you read with them.
Yeah.
Because if you read with them, a couple of things will happen. Number one, you're going to be modeling reading. I mean, that's wonderful. The kids see that you value reading because you're doing it. Number two, you get to share the joy of literature with your kids. You get to share the joy of seeing what happens on their faces. You read about the surprise that happened when somebody went around the corner and that thing happened. And so you get to experience all the emotions with them. It's wonderful and bonding. But number three, you get to spend time with your kids. And you know, it's an even better predictor of academic outcomes in kids than reading is feeling like you're securely attached to your parents, knowing that you matter, knowing that you're in a predictable, safe, secure environment. Like that's it. So rituals of connection, whether it's doing something together every morning. That's part of your 20-mile march maybe, or whether it's reading at nighttime. In our family, every night when we sit around the table and have dinner, we have a conversation that usually centers around what were you grateful for today? What was the thing that made you happiest today? Or what contribution did you make to others today? How were you kind to other people? Who did you help today? We have those kinds of conversations. That's our ritual of connection. We've got our Sunday family meeting. We have our monthly getaway where we go camping, or we go somewhere that's low cost or no cost, maybe just go and visit relatives, and we do that once a month. That's one of our rituals of connection. We've got all these things that we've instituted in our family so that we can make sure that we're having daily, weekly, and monthly, and even quarterly rituals where we are connecting in meaningful ways. That is where our kids are feeling seen, heard, and valued.
Yeah, I love that. And I can't imagine this is a process where you immediately try something and it immediately works. So would you say that this is a bit of trial and error, trying something? Oh, it's not really working for my family. Let's see what else we can do.
No, so Joe, in my family, because I have a PhD and I'm so intentional about it, it works 100% of the time, every time. No, I'm just kidding.
Wow,
I'm just kidding. No. Oh my goodness, we have had so many disasters. We have so many failure stories. It's unbelievable. Sometimes the kids don't want to do it. Sometimes Kylie doesn't want to do it. Sometimes I don't. Like, sometimes I look at Kylie, I'm like, I don't want to be with these people today. I don't like them enough to be with them today. I love them deeply, but I've had enough. I just need some time away from the kids. I don't want to listen to another word out of their mouth. Like, sometimes it just sucks. And the other thing is, like, somebody might be listening to this podcast. They're like, oh yeah, I've got to do my 20-mile march. And they're putting together this list of 10 or 15 things that they want to do to make their families happier. Mm. And sometimes it's just too much. And or you're wanting to do this, and your husband or your wife, your partner looks at you and says, are you nuts? Like, we can't even get the kids to sit at the table and have breakfast together, and you want to do X, Y, Z and A, B, C, D, E, F, and G as well? Like, come on, really? So every time I run a parenting seminar, one of the things that I really emphasize is you're going to go home tonight feeling really pumped, like you can be an absolutely rock star parent. Yeah. And you're going to get in the door and the kids are still going to be awake, and it's going to be 9 o'clock at night. And the first thing you're going to do is say, what's going on? And you've already blown it. Like, you're just going to fail. It's guaranteed. Yeah. But failure. Okay. So if I want to, this is a resilience mindset at its core. If I want to learn another language, my family, we're going to go to Mexico later on this year as a family holiday. Fabulous. And I want to learn a bit of Spanish. So I'm taking some online lessons to learn Spanish. If I want to learn Spanish and become competent as a Spanish speaker, I have to practice. And practice requires time, effort, and failure. I'm going to make mistakes. For me to become a fluent Spanish speaker, I'm probably going to have to make a couple of million mistakes to become good at it. If I want to learn the piano, if I want to become a great surfer, whatever it is, you pick a skill, you have to A, practice it, and B, be willing to push through mistake after mistake a million times to become competent. And parenting is no different. If you want to become a world-class parent, if you want to become a dead set, you don't even have to be world-class. If you just want to be a really, really rock-solid parent for your kids, it requires intentional practice, which means you're going to make mistakes. And then you've got to get back on the horse and try again and try again and try again. And it's only through the consistent and persistent mistake making that we figure out what works and what doesn't. In other words, you have to be willing to absolutely suck so that you can become good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that is so important, because that kind of can be applied to anything in our life. You know, we're trying 100%. To find a new hobby, for example, and we're failing at all these things. Are we just going to stop because we are failing at all these things in an attempt to find a hobby? Maybe, sometimes you might stop there, or you might keep going until you do find that thing that works, because it's going to be so gratifying when you do find it and you're like, wow, this is the thing. This is what we can do.
So, Joe, you've just said something really, really critically important here. I want to pick up on and extend your concept of gratification. Okay. So if I'm looking for a hobby, or if I'm looking for a practice, something that I want to do that has a low threshold for competence, then I'm not going to find it very exciting for very long. It's not going to be gratifying once I've done it a dozen times and proven that I can do it. It becomes boring. It becomes monotonous. So running would be an example. Like, you can put on some running shoes and go for a run, and you're going to be a competent runner within a pretty short period of time. Yeah. The only way that you can keep running exciting is to either make it social, so it's not just about the run, now it's about relationships, or to push for high levels of competence by going faster or going further. That's the only thing that you can do there. Low threshold for basic competence. If you want to do something that's really worthwhile, it typically has a very high threshold for competence. So for me, my favorite thing to do is to go surfing. That's my absolute love. I love surfing. Every wave is different. Conditions are different. Tide's different. Swell direction, swell size, crowd size, maneuvers. Everything about surfing is different every single time. The threshold for competence is enormously high. Even to be able to paddle out at a beach break and catch some waves, some people will try surfing for 3 months before they can even do that. It's a really, really hard sport. And that's what keeps it interesting. So that's hobbies. If you look at parenting and spousal or partnered relationships, they make surfing look like a walk in the park in terms of threshold for competence. To get really good at relationships is extremely hard. That threshold where you can say, okay, I've got this down, it requires a lifetime of practice and mistakes and intentional learning and deliberate effort. And that's what makes it so gratifying, because when you sit around the dining table or you sit in the backyard and watch your family talking or playing, and you know that you've got your relationships on song and that the family is harmonious, there's no feeling like it in all the world. That's my picture of heaven. That's my picture of heaven, to see my family sitting around the table, eating good food, enjoying conversation and loving each other. That's the end goal for me. And oh my goodness, I look at how my 14-year-old feels about my 16-year-old right now, and I wonder if that vision of heaven is ever going to be achieved, right? Because it's so hard, but that's what makes it so worthwhile.
Yeah. Wow. I don't have a family of my own where I can experience that, but I can envision what that would feel like when everything is just fitting and it's harmonious. And that would be extremely gratifying, the best feeling ever. And it's something I look forward to. It sounds amazing.
Yeah, get on it. Go and do it. It's great.
Oh, yeah. I'm
Tomorrow,
working on it. Yeah, I'm working on it. I'll let you know how I go.
All right.
Beautiful. Well, this brings me to our last section for today, which is our open mic. So here I'd love to just extend the mic to you to talk about anything that you would like to, Justin.
Okay, so I obviously knew this was coming, and there were approximately 7,314 things that made it onto my list of what I could talk about.
Naturally.
Of course. You've probably noticed I'm not short of a story or an idea here and there. The thing that I would say is this. Our children have 3 basic psychological needs. This is that self-determination theory thing that I was talking about earlier. They have a need for relatedness, which means connection and belonging. We've talked a lot about that.
Yeah.
They also have a need for competence. We've touched on that. That's the second basic psychological need, the ability to figure out their environment, master it, learn and develop and grow. When we're in an environment that does not support relatedness or does not support competence, that is, when we're going to go into an environment where we don't feel like we know anyone or people are hostile to us, we don't have any connections, or when we're going to go into an environment where we don't know how to do that thing, what we typically find for us and for our kids is motivation tends to be low, and so does well-being. Now, of course, there are some environments that we choose to step into where that is the case, and that's the third basic psychological need, autonomy. Okay, so if autonomy is high, that is, I'm choosing to be here even though it's uncomfortable and I can't do it and I don't know anyone, then we can sort of get over that. But if we're in a situation that we did not choose and those basic psychological needs are not being supported, it just feels horrible. Yeah. If we want our kids to thrive, the best thing we can do outside of having that beautiful connection is to create an environment that supports basic psychological needs. That is, help our kids to be in situations where they're able to develop competence, develop better relationships, and make as many of their own choices as they can in developmentally appropriate ways. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that we let our kids have full autonomy from the age of 2 or 12. Sometimes they don't deserve it until they're 22 or 24, or at least sort of 18 or whatever it might be. So we need to bring adult wisdom to our children's developmental journey and not give them too much too soon.
Yeah.
I'm bringing that up because what I really want to talk about is the challenges that we have with kids and screens. Over the last decade, maybe the last dozen years or so, we've seen a massive decline in the well-being of our children and young people. It's measurable. It's both objective. It's shown in objective data and it's also shown in subjective data. Yeah. We absolutely know without any equivocation that children and young people's well-being is plummeting, and it has been for at least 10 or 12 years. And there are several reasons for this. Number one, overly controlling parenting is a strong predictor of it. Parents are more paranoid about their kids. They're fragile kids. They're non-resilient, anxious kids than they've ever been before. But if we can get out of the kids' way, we'll discover that the problem is us, not them. Like, the kids don't need that much control. They can figure this sort of stuff out. They're born resilient. They're supposed to be resilient. They don't need us interfering. Research shows that as parental control increases, so too does anxiety. Anxiety for parents and anxiety for kids.
Yeah.
Okay. The second thing that I think is contributing to this drop in well-being for our children and young people is a really, really significant drop in unstructured time and play. Our kids simply don't have the capacity to get out and play like they did a generation or two generations ago. And when I say play, I don't just mean in the living room. I mean outside, and I mean down at the local park and down at the beach and even down at the shops, even though no one wants their kids hanging out at the shops because that's where trouble is. We've got really good research that shows that kids do better if they have unstructured time. It doesn't mean no rules. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying there are no rules. We're allowed to have strict rules for our kids, but it means that they need unstructured time. And ideally, they're going to engage in risky play. Risky play is the kind of play where there is height involved, or there is speed involved, or there is impact involved. Like, there's the possibility that they're going to hurt themselves. There's tools involved, hammers, nails, saws. There's this kind of velocity associated with it. And research shows that anxiety disorders drop off when children are engaged in risky play. The more risky play kids are involved in, the less likely it is that they're going to have anxiety disorders. So that's two things. We've got unstructured time and we've got overprotective parenting. The third thing is screens, social media specifically. Over the last half a dozen years, I've flipped and I've flopped and I've flipped and I've flopped on whether or not the data does or doesn't say that social media is impacting our children's well-being. I think now, at the time of recording, 2024, I think that we're at a point where we can pretty confidently say that the data is pointing in the direction that social media is having a deleterious impact on our children and young people's well-being.
Yeah.
And it's hammering their resilience, especially those who are already not doing so well from a resilience point of view. And the ones that aren't doing so well from a resilience point of view, they're the ones that don't have any unstructured time, don't get any risky play, and have overprotective parents. So what do we do about it? I am really pushing extremely hard. I think, I don't want to say this, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think it's too late for a lot of kids. I think that for those who are probably in grade 8 or older, grade 7, grade 8 or older right now, it's too late for them. They're already on social media. They've already got smartphones. They're already into that digital immersion world. The tsunami has swamped them. But the message that I want to share, particularly for parents of kids who are in primary school, kids who are 12 and under, 13 and under, is this. I want to encourage you to slow down your child's introduction to digital media and screens. I want you to reduce their reliance and involvement and engagement with screens. Kids don't need smartphones. They need smart parents. And smart parents give their kids dumb phones. There's a resurgence at the moment in flip phones. And what we need to do is create critical mass for the rising generation so that they know that we're going to slow it down. We're going to give them a flip phone. And in grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, we're going to be having the conversation with them then about how we want them to delay their involvement with social media until they're at least 16. Now, are we going to enforce that hard? Well, it's going to be up to you and your family as to whether you do or not. I don't believe that you really can by that age, but I would encourage parents to be really working hard to plant ideas in their kids' heads that there are better ways to live life than through TikTok and through Instagram and through Snapchat. This stuff is decimating well-being. It's absolutely rupturing relationships. It's crushing resilience. And if we can start with the kids that are coming up now and get the conversations going now and band together with other parents in your school community, you're going to do so much good for your kids. Get them together and let them meet up at the park without screens and play and ride bikes and ride skateboards and throw and kick balls and have a play-based rather than a screen-based childhood. I think that these ideas, and I'm leveraging pretty heavily here. I've switched up a few things, but I don't love everything that Jonathan Haidt says in his brand new book, The Anxious Generation. I don't think everything that he says is practical. I don't think it's really truly doable. So I'm modifying and twisting a little bit of it into something that I believe is actually doable for families. So my open mic moment is really about saying, let's delay kids' exposure to screens and especially social media. Let's start the conversations with them early about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and actively discourage them from having social media platform involvement until they're at least 16, hopefully older. I believe that their lives will be better for it.
Yeah.
That's me. Mic drop.
I love it. And I think you brought a really interesting point about screens, because I'm like going about my day, and I had this moment the other day where I was on a tram and I saw a parent with their kid in a pram, and I was like, okay, normal. And then they turned the pram around and there was their kid sitting in their pram holding an iPad. And I was like, wow, that's a really jarring image, because there's a kid there holding an iPad and their parent is also on their phone. And it just seems like technology and screens are being used to pacify children in moments where parents can't deal with them.
Yeah, it's not even moments where parents can't deal with them. It's just the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And taking the path of least resistance, it makes you weak. It simply does. There's no character formation. It's I don't want to sound all judgy, but I'm going to be judgy. It's the worst thing you can do. I actively would discourage that, and I would genuinely say, don't do it. And this parent is getting it wrong. It's just so harmful, and it's starting from the youngest of ages, like 12, 18 months. It shouldn't be the case. We don't need to have this thing within arm's reach all the time, switched on, attached to our fingertips. It's just not healthy.
Yeah, because I don't know, my phone feels like a part of me. When I don't have my phone, I'm like, where is my phone? I need my phone. And it's developing this reliance on a device that's really it's just a device. But we don't think of it as that. We think of it as like a holy grail of objects that I own. Like, this is the most important thing. I need my phone. I need social media.
Yeah. I thought about getting rid of it, but my life is so integrated with it. I mean, it's all in the cloud. I could get rid of that one and get another one, whatever. But the fact is, absolutely everything, whether it's a camera or whether it's you using your maps, we use them for our exercise workouts and routines, or to time what we're doing. Like in every facet of life, there's an app for that, and it genuinely is useful. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not suggesting that we need to remove screens from our kids' lives or from our own lives. What I'm suggesting, once again, is how can we be more intentional, and how can we protect our kids from the worst of it for as long as possible?
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much, Justin, for having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it. I learned so much about parenting. It's really set me up. I'm keen to get into that phase of my life when it happens tomorrow.
That's right.
But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. I had such an amazing time chatting about this. And yeah, it was a really great time.
Great to be with you, Joe. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. And for those of us who want to find out a bit more about you and your work, where can we go?
Happyfamilies.com.au, or check out the Happy Families podcast. It's the #1 podcast in Australia for parenting and family.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. And for those of us who missed that, don't worry. We've got Justin's details down in the description below. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time. You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.